Hello, and welcome back to, I guess I was going to say the Fight Site MMA podcast, but I don't know if this is an official episode. Although maybe it is. Technically, I guess I'm supposed to be the arbiter of, you know what? Who cares? It's an episode, it's a podcast about MMA for the Fight Site. So all those things are technically true. I am not joined by my usual co-host, Serum. He is taking a sabbatical, and by that I mean just not on this call. I'm actually joined with Bloody Elbow analyst David Castillo. David, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing good, and I appreciate you having me on here. And kind of curious why you chose me at all, because I don't think I'm deserving of this kind of status. But I'm ready, and it sounds like you've got a pretty good topic in the queue because I've got a lot of critical things to say about Fedor. So
Well, first of all, hush with all that self-effacing nonsense. David has worked on a bunch of toe-to-toe previews with Phil McKenzie, who surprisingly I actually haven't had on the show yet. I've had Connor Rebush on, but I guess I gotta get Phil on at some point. But David and Phil write toe-to-toe previews for a lot of UFC main events. David also does specific editorial pieces for Bloody Elbow and the sober play-by-play, which I would love seeing make a return. Those are some of my favorites that you write.
oh man.
But David's been a writer for a long time, and quite a good analyst to boot. And so I was always looking for a reason to have him on the show, and so I'm excited to have him on today. And today we are discussing, again, a bit of a left field topic. I feel like I'm doing that a lot lately. I just finished up like a piece on Eddie Alvarez's Ringcraft, and now we're talking about Fedor. None of this is like really super relevant to the modern MMA sphere. But that's part of the fun of the Fight Site is that we get complete and utter freedom to do whatever we want. And so I take that. I take liberty with that.
By the way,
have a discussion. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that. I was just gonna say, I feel like that's pretty representative of 2020. Like, I just did a pop culture podcast with a buddy of mine in which we answered the age-old question. Why did action heroes want to kill their dads in the 90s? Like, 90s action movies seem to be the time of, like, action heroes to fight age-inappropriate villains, like Stallone versus John Lithgow, Stallone versus James Woods, Seagal versus Tommy Lee Jones, or that hillbilly kid from A Few Good Men versus Brian Dennehy in the 90s classic Gladiator. Yes, a non-Russell Crowe movie called Gladiator in the 90s. So I think that's pretty like, I think you're on the right wavelength for 2020. Just talking about random shit. Because what else are we going to do?
Yeah.
Think about the apocalypse?
Exactly. Anything that passes at the time. But this is the sort of one connecting thread that I guess I'll attempt, I'd say that lightly, attempt to try to tie this all together. 2020 has also been a very unique year for MMA beyond just the sort of COVID side of it, which, you know, maybe had an effect, although maybe not. It just seems like a lot of the sports paragons seem to be retiring. Last weekend we had Anderson Silva retire from the UFC. Again, it's fighter retirement. I'm hoping that means he's done completely. Maybe we'll see him in Bellator in a couple weeks, but nonetheless, ostensibly finished fighting. Khabib retired the week before. We had Henry Cejudo hang up the gloves, again, assuming that he's actually finished fighting and not trying to come back to coach a season of The Ultimate Fighter with Alexander Volkanovski. I'm not even about to argue about how little sense that may make. And then, even Stipe Miocic closed up the book with long-standing rival and my all-time favorite fighter, as everybody knows, Daniel Cormier, who then retired as well. It just kind of feels like a lot of people are exiting the sport for a myriad of reasons, and that's fine. That's, I never hate seeing fighters retire, particularly if it's a little bit earlier in their careers. So today we are going to discuss a fighter who should be retired. Is he retired? Do you know that? I'm not sure.
I don't think so.
Have a word on that? No.
I don't. No.
Fedor Emelianenko. And really what caught my eye on this was something that David pointed out, and we will get into this in a minute, about not really Fedor's legacy, which tends to be the big defining question when people talk about him as, the greatest heavyweight ever. It's more, this is the fight site. We're a little more granular than that. He discussed Fedor as a technical fighter and how well he adjusted his game over time, or, topic that I really can't get away from, how he adapted to the sport's trending meta. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, David, you would argue that he didn't quite adjust to that. So I'll stop here. I'm gonna throw it to you, and I'll let you sort of say your piece about Fedor and where you stand on him, and then we can begin the discussion. So, what was your tweet? I'm hesitant to say it because I don't want people think that I'm lying about it. But I think your words were technically awful. So I'm throwing you under the bus. Have fun.
All right. I appreciate that. I'm not like, so this wasn't like a Skip Bayless moment for me. Like, it's not like, I'm not here to say like, Fedor sucks, man. Like, why were, of course, full disclosure, like I was in the middle of like the underground forum and like Sherdog.net debates about like UFC versus Pride. This is that kind of era of like Republican versus Democrat style like animosity among MMA fans. So like I was definitely a part of that, and early on maybe that sort of biased me in terms of like, all right, I get it, yes, cyborg memes, okay, cool, but I just want to start by saying that Fedor is one of my favorite fighters to watch, like pretty much ever. I mean, yes, he's remembered as being like the heavyweight GOAT, but to me, it was always about the anticipation of violence in a Fedor fight that I think was second to none. Like with most fighters, you knew what you were getting and you kind of knew how. You knew GSP would take the fight to the ground, how he would try to get it there. It's like everybody else, or like Nog, Aldo, McGregor, whatever, but Fedor was like this whirlwind of violent ridge hands and arm bars. But I think the main thing is that, and I guess maybe like the first maybe point of contention we kind of talk about is the fact that Fedor only defended his title 4 times. And that's a very superficial point, so I'll kind of explain myself. Now, well, MMA nerds point out that Pride had Grand Prix, and this took away from Fedor's amount of title defenses. Yeah, of course. And in general, it is a superficial point, so I'm not dying on the hill that Fedor sucks, but I am dying on the hill that Fedor's legacy is not Mount Rushmore quality, because I think what else defines someone's like title reign specifically than how many times they successfully defended from a number 1 contender. Yes, those awesome Grand Prix were awesome, but like, Fedor's road to the rematch with Nog was like Mark Coleman, Kevin Randleman, and Naoya Ogawa. And yeah, Coleman was good early in his career, but he had already washed out of the UFC. I think he'd lost like the last 3 fights of his. And yes, Randleman earned, quote unquote, earned the shot by like pancaking Cro Cop with a left hook. But this was like a Randleman that also got destroyed by like Sakuraba and Rampage in his previous 2 fights. And so after beating Nog and Pride, literally the only fights worth a damn were the Nog rematches and Mirko. Like that's it. So I think that's why you can, it's kind of, maybe we're kind of like jumping to different points, but I think that's why you can maybe make the case that even someone like Nog had the better resume because he was fighting Fedor and elite contenders like Karatanov, who was really good at the time, Barnett, Verdum, like Fedor just didn't have any of that in his resume.
I think that is an interesting point to jump to, and it is something that I've pointed out about Fedor in the past. I mean, it can be hard to. This is something that I think it actually was Phil McKenzie, your partner, that pointed it out about Anderson Silva's resume, because I think Anderson Silva had a little bit of the same, not in terms of title defenses, but a little bit of the same criticism can be applied in terms of his level of competition. And something that Phil pointed out was like, you sort of just have to fight who's in front of you. At the end of the day, like you can't always pick and choose your opposition. I mean, Nog's win over Verdum, I think aged quite well. Even if Verdum beat him later on, like it's a win that you really couldn't have sort of expected or seen coming turning out to be as useful as it was. Whereas Fedor often was just sort of, as said, in these sort of Grand Prix, he had to fight who was in front of him, like Coleman and Randleman, which are not, they're not meaningless by any means. I do think that you can go back and look at Fedor's list of victories. I think probably around 2006. I'd say that sort of that end of Pride run was sort of where his the sort of peak Fedor's peak operating window might have closed up. And I would agree with you. I think the two victories over Big Nog and then the Krokop win, which really stands as kind of his, probably Fedor's defining moment, if you ask me, because it was an official title defense. It was one of the earliest examples of a really, strategically and tactically astute game plan. But you're looking at some of these other fights like, Ogawa and, Goodridge and, even Zulazinho. It's like, these are not let's talk about the greatest opposition here. And as you said, they weren't technically official wins. I sort of have to wonder. I mean, I'm a younger fan. I'm only 24, but like, I wonder if some of the sort of machinations behind Pride as an organization just facilitated a sort of greater number of, just throw them at the wall and see what sticks. Like, just kind of usher in a variety of fighters to face Fedor to keep him busy. I mean, how many of these were squash matches, I guess is what I'm asking.
I mean, quite a few, right? I think that's where my criticism with Fedor like starts, which is that, like his reign, like his historic run, like happened at a time where literally like half of the heavyweight talent in the world was on the other side. And while this is happening, just like the bulk of in fact, I think the only ranked matches like during his title run were his title defenses. Everything else is just like these freak show fights, which were a lot of fun. Like, and by the way, like I'm not trying to diminish Fedor's technique. In fact, I'm going to emphasize this by bringing up a really lame analogy. So I played Magic the Gathering. And I play competitive Magic. And in competitive Magic, you generally have 3 different archetypes for competitive decks: aggro, combo, and control. I've always been an aggro player, and I think one of the keys to playing an aggro deck efficiently is so-called forcing them to have it. In Magic, like in poker, you don't know what's in their hand, so maybe they have a removal spell for your creature, like a goblin or elf. Yes, I know this is super nerdy. Guys don't want to turn it off right now. Give me a second.
We're going to have fans that are eating this up. Keep going.
Or like a counter spell for your burn spell. And sometimes you want to play around those things. You want to play around the counter spell or the creature removal, but sometimes you want to make them have it. And that's how I think of Fedor. Like, that's why, like, despite all my criticism of his legacy, he's still one of my favorite fighters, because to me, he was like the OG red mage, to borrow just more nerdy terminology. Like the art of the barrage. Like, maybe the opponent is working on timing a counter right hand or a takedown. Maybe they're not sure, but Fedor would just always force them to make them have it. And if they don't, then they're on their back foot. I think it's telling that, like, Fedor, like, never really had a diverse arsenal. Like, wasn't like a kicker, didn't really have a great jab, didn't uppercut. It was just like these angular, like, punch entries of just like
Starting shots.
Yeah. There was absolutely nothing special technically about it, but at the same time, and like, I think the Krokop fight was a great example where like he won a lot of those exchanges by just like, you got the left kick, you got it in your back pocket, you don't? All right, well, if you have it, you better have it now. That kind of thing. And, even though, yeah, a lot of that fight was won, with like wrestling, nonetheless, I think that's a good example of like why, yeah, I really feel like if we list his main wins like Nog and Krokop, we list them because that's all he had. Not because like, oh, well, had some other stuff and we can like weigh other wins versus those and how they age, because there was just nothing else to work with.
So I I really appreciate what you pointed out about, Fedor in terms of sort of what he asked his opponents. Because I mean, this is sort of harping on something I've talked a lot about uh, in MMA, which is initiative. I think Fedor was one of those examples of a fighter who understood how to hold the initiative from a very early point. That doesn't necessarily mean he was always the best responder in all the right ways. Like, his wrestling defense, which we may talk about a little bit later. His striking defense, as you said, is sort of strike diversity, depth on the field. Like, there are things that can be questioned about it, but he understood some intrinsic truths of fighting in MMA and really kind of fighting heavyweights. A lot of these people can't fight going backwards. If you are able to feint quickly enough and you're able to draw reactions out, a lot of times fighters in MMA will show you their hand. Like, this is contrasting again with boxing is like fighters in MMA are a lot quicker to respond to feints with, big reactions, showing off, whatever it is they had. Like you said, with Krokop, the left kick, if you have it, you better show it now. In boxing, boxers are far more likely to, to keep some of their tricks to themselves and not be caught out by feints, but I guess that's a different discussion. It does, it does interest me in watching Fedor in that regard. That is something that I think about when I go back and watch some of his fights, is how he was, he seemed to understand, some more intangibles about fighting, like initiative and momentum, directionality. Like there were seeds there. There were things that he understood about it that, maybe a lot of other people, contemporary fighters just didn't. It just took a lot longer for them to come around to those kinds of ideas.
Musashi.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Like, Musashi was, yeah, absolutely. That's been a long-standing problem for him. Um, but, it's one thing to be a fighter who understands those kinds of intangibles. And it's another thing to be a fighter with those sort of intangibles with the skill set to really, strengthen it and really play to your strengths. And I guess one of the reasons I really brought you on the show and wanted to talk to you about it is because I really sort of wanted to get from you how you evaluate Fedor's skill set. I feel like heavyweight sometimes exists in this sort of void where you can imagine, like, you can transplant a Derek Lewis back to Pride and maybe he'll have more success than people think. Or at least, more than people might assume. But it is sort of the skill set of Fedor that interests me the most in terms of, doing more contemporary sort of comparative analysis. So I'll let you go there.
As much as I feel like I question Fedor's legacy because I feel like it's, the Jordan Breen has that kind of really useful heuristic, like who did you beat, when did you beat them, and how did you do it? And I feel like that who did you beat question is the one that Fedor, I don't feel like really truly like answered in a way that warrants the kind of reverence people talk to him about. So that's why it's kind of funny for me to say, you know what, like I think Prime Fedor is still really good today. Like I don't think his legacy is great, or certainly not what it's argued up as, but if you were to transplant him into today's like heavyweight arena and the annoying blubberfest that we typically get, I think the reason why he's still good today is that heavyweight like only ever gets talent like around the edges, so to speak. Like if somebody's really good at one thing, chances are they're bad at something else. Like Miocic, great, technical-ish. Like Miocic is like a great technical striker. I don't want to say great, but technical striker, understanding of the game, movement, yada yada, generally well-rounded, but he moves like a cargo loader from Aliens. And like, so, just no athleticism, right? Like Cormier. Let's use some more nerdy analogies. Cormier, he's like the Princess Leia to John Jones's Jabba the Hutt, except the chain used to choke Jabba was cocaine, right? Couture was the quote unquote the brainy one, but he had hip dysplasia, right? Cain Velasquez, the elite wrestle boxer, but then he had like the no neck trainer tell him to do dumbass leg extensions that tore apart his knee, right? Joe Grasso. So there's always an asterisk around every heavyweight talent. And I think that's where Fedor shines. Like, even though, yeah, his defensive grappling was suspect, everything else, he had it more or less going on. And there's no real asterisks in terms of like that kind of all around sort of velocity that's needed to be effective at heavyweight.
That kind of sparked a thought to me, which is I mean, and I say this, I'm a staff writer for the fight site. I understand we have a bit of a reputation for being critical of the big boys. I get it. But I will sort of say this in defense of a lot of them, because we can make comparisons and say, like, Miocic is he's a fine heavyweight puncher, if you will. But does he really do anything drastically better on the feet than like a Robert Whittaker, for example? Probably not. But you also need to sort of consider heavyweight as a division and be like, would it really be useful for someone that size to be trying to get into layered exchanges, trying to, grade 8 their jab and set up, with insane output and all the sort of things, with like a blistering array of feints? Like, probably not. I'm not trying to excuse the quality of some of these fighters. I guess it's just you sort of have to consider the division that you're in. And with Fedor, one of the reasons I'll always respect him is that he also, beyond understanding those intangibles, as I pointed out, but he also seemed to understand exactly what it would take to be a good heavyweight in MMA. Like, it was that sort of forward movement. It wasn't particularly pretty ring cutting. He still was he spent a lot of time just sort of following Krokop around, but forward movement enough to push guys on the back foot, attacking in transitions, which is something that even high level MMA fighters today struggle with. And there's obviously his grappling and his ground game to consider as well. He seemed to have a game built that was at least designed for his division's meta. And I think there's value in that. Yes, you can make criticisms. Maybe, again, there's probably some sort of technical ceiling for heavyweights in general, that just may not exist for the lower weight classes. The same thing is true in boxing. Like, boxers need to, in lighter weight classes, just have a different focus for their skill sets, but that doesn't mean they should be, evaluated differently or unfairly as well. You can still analyze these two together for comparison's sake. I digress. Fedor is at least someone who you can look at any point in his career, until maybe the Strikeforce run, which we'll probably get to in a bit. It just made sense. Like, it was it had played off his innate strengths, like his hand speed. And if you're someone who has that sort of natural speed and quickness, like attacking in transitions and feinting level changes, and like that's exactly what you should be doing. So maybe it is the right game. Like, maybe it is the right technical arsenal.
Yeah, I don't really like have anything much to add, except that I think that's kind of like the one of the reasons why like MMA, like striking in MMA has taken so long to evolve, which is that striker, like, it's like otherwise very like good techniques, like tried and true techniques, like the jab, for example, is like seen as kind of, sort of like high risk, low reward maybe. And so it's just like MMA strikers, like, they fall in love with power because it's just easier to take advantage of power. As Joe Rogan is just like always quick to remind us, hey, they're little 4-ounce baby gloves that do nothing but cover the knuckle, guys. And so, that's so at heavyweight, this is just so much more pronounced, right? This needs. So yeah, totally agree with you on kind of like, I think the physics just don't lend itself to like real technical striking and like technical exchanges, but I think it's also just sort of like it's also part of MMA itself, just part of its DNA that kind of doesn't really lend itself to efficiency.
Yeah, yeah. I think I'm in a complete agreement there. To save a little bit of face, because I'm sure there's some writers on our site. Some of my colleagues are probably frustrated at me for going to bat for the heavyweights. How dare I? Um, like, I completely understand that like the lighter divisions are generally far more skilled. And I think I think some of it may just be in heavyweight. Part of the issue just could be training. Like as I said, it's not all that valuable to be able to execute a sort of, a flanking shift past a southpaw's lead shoulder and, like attack the open side with body shot. Like, as you said, it doesn't really seem that economical in the sport. Like for them, it kind of seems like a waste of time. If your gas tank is it's inherently limited. There's certain points of emphasis. And so you need to be able to emphasize like whatever it is your strengths are. And I think that Fedor absolutely did that. I guess my next question is like, was that did that kind of become a problem for him? Because as he started to, go further into his career, he kind of started to realize that he had a hand speed advantage and that he had a kind of, transitional edge and that he realized that he could punch pretty hard. Like at one point did that sort of realization equate to a bit of a technical regression? Because I know the Strikeforce run tends to be where people mark it as kind of the end of Fate, or at least when the sports trending meta kind of began to catch up with him. Like you shouldn't be trying to play a sprint grappling game from your back against heavyweights. It's probably not going to work. So what do you think about that? Is my timeline right there, or do you think that it actually may have happened a bit sooner, and that there was, pieces of Fedor's well-rounded game kind of got stripped away, and that maybe emphasized how far he began to fall?
Well, like I would say that, so this is where I kind of just, really doubled down on this, like, Fedor's legacy. It's not what SureDog.net fans want you to believe it is, which is that I really feel like the sort of the run away from like a post-Pride into Strikeforce, was not like an example of like Fedor deteriorating. And some of the ways you can tell that is just like, even his fights nowadays, like he still has a lot, obviously not the same chin or durability, but still has really good speed, really good power. And I think what happened once you got into Strikeforce is that, not that he was exposed, but that these matchups against like these sort of like kind of more hybrid-ish fighters, like fighters that he didn't really see even in his quote unquote historic run, right? Like a Barnett type or like Karatanov, Verdum. I mean, like these guys beat him largely on the back of like just kind of really good hybrid-ish in the case of Verdum, like grappling. Like, I mean, to me, like I could totally see Verdum submitting Fedor, who was never good defensively, like on the ground. I mean, this is a guy that got his back taken by Mark Coleman, the whole key lock. I think it's a little inflated. I don't think Mark Hunt like had him in serious trouble, but nonetheless, like the fact that Mark Hunt had him in side control, pretty damning. And Silva, even though he's kind of just like a big lunk, still pretty technical guy for a guy his size. And Fedor was just trying to like, just doing these dojo level, like, just bridge and roll, like out of like mount and all this ridiculous stuff. And And I think that was a testament to his lack of acumen, especially defensively on the ground, which is something that I think would have been exposed at any point in his career.
And in the clinch too, a little bit, which was one of the big things that stuck out to me when I went back and rewatched it. Like his ability to frame and pummel and fight grips on the inside is just non-existent. He just can't really do it at all. And that was sort of maybe the biggest thing. I know some of it was sort of made out to be like, the ring versus the cage, and maybe there's some truth to that, but it was more just like when Silva locked up with him, it really wasn't tough to like pull Fedor's legs right out from under him because he couldn't frame properly. He couldn't shrimp his hips. He couldn't pummel, or turn Silva out. It was kind of in sort of classic, Japanese MMA sort of way, like you sort of let your opponent, you sort of accept the fight that you're given and compete in that place. And that was a massive, massive issue. So it's just like, it's something like that I've always sort of wondered. And I guess when people bring up Fedor, they also sort of tend to bring up like, well, how would he do? How would like a peak Fedor do in a modern heavyweight sphere? And the thing is, I'm tempted to say that some of those things would probably still exist for him. Like I think that a Curtis Blades would probably always be really tough for Fedor because, I'm not sure, I could trust Fedor to sprawl on Blades or to fight grips on the inside or to frame him out. That the way that you hold the initiative is different now. Like a lot of modern fighting is a lot more about you do what you're going to do and you keep the opponent from doing what they want to do. It's not you sort of beat your opponents based on what they're giving you, and you can, you're pretty well-rounded everywhere. You can compete pretty much everywhere. It's a lot more mutually exclusive now. Does that sound right?
Yeah, it sounds like it's kind of like, like in order to sort of be effective at heavyweight, you just have to have the highest ceiling. Whereas like, lighter weights, if you're like you got like the high floor skill set, you're going to be set. Heavyweight, no, I mean, you got to be like a massive guy who's got like massive power, or just like a technician like Daniel Cormier.
That's an interesting way to put it. Like the sort of the floor versus the ceiling, I guess to be a functional heavyweight, the floor is maybe a bit higher, but the ceiling's much lower.
Right.
Yeah. Well, then I guess I am sort of curious from you, like what would it be, what would a modern version of Fedor look like in the modern sphere? Like, David, walk me through it.
Honestly, like, I feel like even though I write about this on a sort of weekly basis, like, I just don't know that I have a good handle of like heavyweight right now. Like, even though I feel like he would be very good, I can also see a universe where he's just very bad, just the wrong matchups at the wrong time, because as I've been like just constant like reminded, like I don't feel like Fedor's skill set was ever, I feel like even though he was great at certain things, he also was never really positioned against certain styles. Like I said, like I really feel like someone like Josh Barnett would have been just like a terror for him, just because again, he wasn't a guy that was used to dynamic wrestlers. Certainly not the kind of the sort of wrestle boxer stereotype that, really kind of started to like blossom like post tough and things like that. So, I mean, I certainly don't like, I wouldn't pick him to beat guys like Blades or Cormier, but I wouldn't be surprised if he just absolutely like dumpstered Miocic, who I think has trouble with those kind of, in those sort of explosive exchanges, those barrages. I mean, like even Nagano like caught him with stuff, which like to his credit, he didn't die from those punches. But the combination punching that Fedor was capable of, like, could totally see him just getting outright, like, just wiped out. And I could also see Miocic just, taking him down and grinding him out. I mean, that's not something Fedor was accustomed to. It's not something he encountered because he just never got those matchups. It was just all Japanese pro wrestlers and Nogueira. That was pretty much it.
Yeah. No, I think about that a lot. Because it is, for as many people as Fedor fought, it's not like he fought a variety of different kinds of styles, if that makes sense. Like there weren't, the one thing that you could say about Stipe is that he's a fighter who fought a great array of heavyweights. He had to deal with us, pressuring JDS versus sort of outboxing against Verdum. He had to deal with the shorter, faster man and DC and a larger sort of lumbering power puncher in Ngannou and like so on and so forth. It's just, he had a lot of terrain to cross in a variety of different ways. And it wasn't really, that just sort of wasn't in Fedor's, I shouldn't say it wasn't in his wheelhouse. It just wasn't really available to him. Some of, as you said, Nogueira sort of kept out some of the potentially interesting matches and the other ones were, halfway across the world. So you sort of have to think about it and like would that really work? Maybe it wouldn't. He wasn't. I don't know if maybe I'm just misremembering, but I don't know if Fedor was someone I'd always look at as being dominant in a specific area in fights. Like there was rarely like one sort of positional edge that he would continually press. As you said previously, like GSP was someone you could always point to and look at, they're going to take it to the ground, but Fedor was like a bit of a mystery. And so when I sort of think in these matchups in my head, like how would that look? I sort of don't really know. Maybe the real question is like, how would Fedor approach these fights? It's like, I'm not really sure. And I guess the thing that's sort of bringing it all together for me is the fact that heavyweight may never evolve. And that's fine. Let them do their thing. They're big boys. They need a paycheck too. Let them have some fun. But as a division, I don't think it's ever really undergone a massive technical rebirth where we, there are points that we can look at in featherweight where, suddenly everybody was a competent striker and more people were, you had your Chad Mendez's and your Frankie Edgars, were powerful wrestlers who became competent strikers and so forth. That may never happen for heavyweight or light heavyweight. But that also makes discussions about like displacing this sort of, great hero in Fedor Emelianenko, this fighter who's been mythologized, as you pointed out, like displacing him into a modern sphere and seeing how things would look. At the very least, I guess I'd be interested in it. Like, maybe we'd see a lot more, a much spottier record if he was forced to face like a different variety of style types. As you said, potentially even Barnett. But he's also someone who, as I said, knew how to press his advantages and understood some of those interstitial pieces of fighting that it took his contemporaries a lot longer to come around on. So if he actually, wound up having a lot of success, and not like that would surprise me either.
Yeah, it's kind of, talking about sort of, a lot of these other fighters and thinking about like kind of how he would have done. So I recently wrote about Anderson Silva's legacy and had that kind of cliched moment of clarity. And I think what I came to realize, like thinking more about it, is that I think legacies in MMA are not legacies at all, but they're MMA legacies. So I know that maybe like makes no sense, but if you consider time a critical piece of building a legacy, and most of these guys are going undefeated for 2 to 4 years before getting pistol whipped by Fabio Maldonado, then that's not Wayne Gretzky
Right.
leading the league and scoring for 12 years and winning 4 cups. So I guess what I mean is that I think MMA legacies, however we've seen that, I think MMA legacies, in other words, can be whatever we want it to be. It's like, so what if Habib only defended his belt twice? never lost and just grappled the shit out of his opponents. Like, that's amazing. That's awesome. And so what if John Jones was a loose cannon of like cocaine lines and Twitter tantrums? Like, nobody beat him in the cage, even when he spent less time training for his opponents than like making internet beefs with like gay Swedish teenagers, right? So, I mean, I think legacy, like MMA legacies, they're crude, they're short-lived, and that's because fighters are still figuring out what works and what doesn't. Like in other sports, techniques are refined enough that you're not going to see dramatic shifts in styles. And so I think that's kind of where Fedor sort of enters that picture.
It's funny you say that because I'm being completely serious. I was actually thinking about that exact something along those lines. Literally just a couple days ago. As I continue to sort of trudge through this metagame series, which I have a new one coming out soon. I think it's
Oh,
the
shameless
seventh
plug. Yes.
one. Yeah. You see, like how I did that? But no, I was thinking like, what do I really care about in fighters? Like, what is it that really is of interest to me when it comes to writing and evaluating fighters and their legacies and the strides that they make? And it really seems to come down to the fighters who really try to do something different. And that doesn't always mean, doing something like Kakuno trying to punch Tony Ferguson's fist. I mean, it's the fighters who sort of seek to really challenge what I perceived to be, quality fighting, for lack of a better term. It is a lot of these times that I look back at examples to fish for in these articles, and something comes up that I may not even have really realized or really thought about. And maybe, I think that's an interesting way to frame it, is that MMA legacies are kind of whatever you want them to be, without people sort of, sticking to the greatest ever discussions, which get kind of boring. For me, I'm a little bit more interested in seeing, like, can you be like the best version of yourself that you can be as a fighter? Like what can I look back on in your career and recognize as a really impressive stride? What was a really disappointing setback? Like what is it that you did that I can, I can latch onto, that I can read into? I came to you a few months ago when I was writing one of these articles about, Jacare Souza being having an interesting, to say the least. I don't really know what Jacare's legacy is going to be. I really don't. I remember him as being a fighter who never quite prioritized his skill set the way that he should have to be the most effective fighter he could have been. Fedor Emelianenko is not someone I'm going to remember that way. I'll remember Fedor as someone who understood the intrinsic pieces of fighting much earlier than his contemporaries. He was someone who clearly got MMA on a technical level and on a sort of hypothetical level. He understood the need for initiative, the need to push a pace, the need for, to push opponents into their, or outside of their comfort zones, to force their hands. And honestly, that's kind of a more interesting legacy for me. Like, I think that's a more interesting place to leave Fedor in discussions than any kind of, any kind of ranking, or, however people want to do that. Those tend to be the things that really stick out when you look back on fighters. Am I making sense?
You're making perfect sense. I'm just still completely thrown off by Kakuno.
Oh yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out that, like Joe Rogan like typically goes like just ape shit for like innovations and like, oh man, Machida's so elusive, bro. And like Kakuno was like the one time where like Joe Rogan was like just immediately skeptical. Like, what is he doing? Like, is he punching? like punching the punches, where he's just kind of like, man, this guy is not doing something that I think is, of course he's not doing something that's efficient, but like for Joe Rogan's like kind of stoner mentality, oh my God, it's
Tried to innovate. You could be sure of that.
so like I guess as you bring that up, as you kind of like talk about that, I think that's kind of where I like land with Fedor, which is like he dominated at a time when when the sort of shift in styles was kind of inert. And so I kind of think of Fedor as like a heavyweight version of like Takanori Gomi, if that makes any sense. Like maybe that's going to
Oh
sound
yeah.
disrespectful. But like, yeah, Gomi was a good example of, I mean, he was the best lightweight on earth at one point. And, and again, this is during the time where like, UFC like didn't have, they didn't have the lightweight division. Then they kind of brought it back and it sort of started to like evolve and grow. But like Gomi was a guy, like you said, that just knew exactly like who he was, like really kind of bridged that gap between sort of practical fight knowledge and theoretical fight knowledge, where it's just like bringing the two together to just like land big strikes on his opponent and just doing that in a way that was like 100% like his instincts, like what was comfortable to him.
And I can appreciate that. Like that is something that I can sort of stick to, something that's, tangible. And probably a more, maybe a more charitable version of or vision of Fedor's legacy than his just flatly his resume. Because I think that is something that I really wanted to sort of celebrate about him. I feel like I say this a lot recently. Is there's the sort of public perception of a fighter, and then there's the elements to a fighter that I find interesting, the things that I really want to celebrate about them, and those things are rarely ever congruent. I mean, sometimes they are. Sometimes you can look at a GSP and you could see that the dominant superstar is really like, well, he was like that was his thing, is that he really rarely lost rounds and he was dominant and he figured out a system and a way to be, a dominant fighter. But I think sometimes it's the lesser recognized qualities that tend to shine the brightest when I really look back on fighters. And I think Fedor is one of those examples. There's problems with the resume, but it's, it is that natural inclination for MMA that I think really sticks out to me. And that's something that's always worth celebrating and introducing newer fans to, because it may not be, that's something that's a lot more likely to get kind of lost as time goes on, as people move further and further away from a fighter's prime, from a fighter's peak, or, maybe they didn't even see Fedor at all. It's that kind of knowledge behind it that tends to be what really counts.
So like co-signed absolutely, but I just want to like kind of also just mention like a few last things, which is that I think what I've come to appreciate Fedor more as he's gotten older, because I think his recent fights kind of reveal more of like who he already was in just a more vulnerable way. Like, I mean, like the fight against like Fabio Maldonado, like, I mean, you're talking about the husk of Fedor, like, well, maybe not even like the husk. Fedor is like the fart gust of his former self at this point. And Maldonado's not like a great or even good fighter, but he's a solid like ham and egger with good boxing chops. And like Fedor walks right into a right hand left hook combination. And there's like one point where he gets up after getting dropped, ground and pounded, and like he just looks like he's like fish dancing his way to an early grave. Like just no legs, no wits, but like just nothing but guts, and makes like to me like probably the most impressive comeback I've seen, like outside of like maybe like Barry versus Congo or something like that, because it's like Fedor using nothing but like his just raw volition and manages to make a fight of it, because like just that's Fedor. Like he was just, I think, one of the most purely, I don't know how else to like say this without like just sounded unsophisticated, but like purely physical fighters, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's perfectly fair. It wasn't just like leveraging chin or, punching power always, but he knew how to make the big boys move. And as you've pointed out, David, big boys don't always like to move. Sometimes it could really be that simple. Just like, not even always can you force an opponent backwards. Can you just make an opponent move a lot? And maybe they don't like that. That is a huge oversimplification, but when you're talking about heavyweights, sometimes those simplifications help. David, thank you very much for coming on and discussing this with me. This was a pleasure to have you on.
Ah, thank you. It was a pleasure to be on.
Absolutely. Love to have you on again. You're welcome anytime. Do you have anything that I can plug right now? Because this is your chance.
Oh, I do not have anything to plug. I mean, if you guys like already know me, then chances are like you've kind of stuck with it, reading my Bloody Elbow work, and that's pretty much all I do, man. I try to pretend that I'm gonna be like a science fiction writer in the future, and I still work on my novel, but it's still slow going. And then of course I've written about hockey in the past, but nobody gives a shit about hockey, so we won't do that.
That's not why we're here. Maybe you could do a hockey fight, like a hockey fight analysis.
Oh, that's a great one.
That would actually be really fun. I know Jack Slack did a kangaroo brawl article once. That was pretty good. So keep pushing the boundaries. I have, as I said, I have a metagame piece which I think should be going up soon. I know Ed said he wanted to hold it because of the election. Not like there's anything going on there. So that should be coming out sometime this next week, and then I imagine as I said, I finished up another Alvarez Ringcraft piece today, which I just wrote for fun. That's the thing; it's not really particularly relevant to anything, but it was fun to write, and I'd been meaning to write it for a while. So whenever that ends up going up, be sure to read that. Probably assume it's going to be held for a little while. I know the next few UFC cards are ass, and no one I know Zayn took a bit of a beating when he said that they weren't very good, but I'll say it again. There's not really a lot to get excited on, but if something comes up, maybe I'll discuss in the future. I do know that I'm not sure when, but looking forward to some of the upcoming cards. Maybe we'll do a pay-per-view preview or after the fact. And we would love to have you on for that, if you want to do something like that, because I think you'd be a fun person to go fight by fight with on some of the big names on these pay-per-view cards with Sherm and I. So if we can
I would be honored.
figure this out, great. Let's do it. We'll have to, again, I'm not really sure what's upcoming, but something happens, we can make that happen. So again, David, thank you very much. You guys can follow David on Twitter at David Castillo AC, I believe is your handle.
Yes,
and check out his work on bloodyelbow.com. You can follow me at dmarty77, and you can check out all of the wonderful writing of me and my colleagues on the Fight site. So stay tuned for more. Thank you guys so much. Stay safe.
Thank you.